I have the pleasure of, again, being with Mike Smeed, Managing Director in InMotion Ventures. Mike, do you want to, oh, thank you. Do you want to give a quick introduction while I quench my thirst here?
Better say part-time waiter, full-time management director of InMotion. So, hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Smeed. I'm the Managing Director of InMotion Ventures. We're the venture capital arm of JLR, Jaguar Land Rover, a car company based here in the UK. And it's our job to invest in startups that are going to help our parent company, JLR, transform primarily through the climate, industrial, and enterprise technologies that are really critical to the strategic transformation of our company, but also automotive more generally.
All right, now we've talked in years past in detail about InMotion Ventures and what you do and how you do it. But today we're going to talk about a major fundamental reset of InMotion Ventures that occurred in 2023. Yeah, yep. And has probably been in process. But so before we talk about what the reset was, can we talk a little bit about the causal factors? What happened?
Yeah, so this will become a bit of a running theme over the next kind of 15 minutes, that we had a CEO and a CSO change. And there's a lot going on in automotive. You'll probably recognize most of the people who are miserable and tired in this room will be working in the automotive industry and in some kind of shape or form, because it's an industry that's going through kind of, I would say, unparalleled change. And actually through my career, I had the great fortune of working in retail when .com wasn't a thing and then became a big thing. So for some reason, I've managed to kind of find myself in industries that are going through kind of changes like this. And really what happened was, and what's happening, and in fact, the level of change and uncertainty is increasing, which I found quite strange when I've thought back over that 3-year period. But what's happening in automotive at the moment is automotive and OEMs are being stretched into areas of the value chain that they were never really involved in before. So automotive, and again, cover your ears if you're really embedded in it, but it was relatively kind of straightforward. You kind of designed a car, you then spoke to a load of really big suppliers to get the parts, you then assembled the parts, you sold them to dealers who were also big companies. The dealers then handled the messy bit, which was selling them to customers. So actually the bits that the OEMs were involved in was relatively kind of short in the kind of the value chain. What's happening now is that if we go kind of towards the front, automotive brands are becoming much more consumer-led and thought about the brand that's being created and want, like many companies do, to have a much greater involvement with the end consumer of the car, of the client, and the ownership of the experience, particularly in a dealership, because again, it's not, for the second biggest purchase you're likely to make in your life after your house, it's never really been the greatest experience from a customer perspective. But also with the increasing changes and uncertainty in regulation, particularly led by Europe, what's happening is we're getting kind of dragged further down into the value chain as well. Mm-hmm. So with things like the product passport, the battery passport, circularity, there was, again, we heard from our colleagues at eBay earlier on about the importance of circularity, and that's really impacting a lot of manufacturers, because going forward, we're now really focusing in on what's the material. We've got to care where that material comes from. We've got to know where that material comes from a provenance perspective of what goes into our vehicle to begin with. But also we've got some really valuable things in our cars now, batteries and rare earths and critical materials that we want to hold on to for much longer. So again, that relationship is really changing, and that's been, I think, alongside people have maybe concentrated on things like autonomous driving, which is always, 5 years away from wherever you say it's from, and the technological advances definitely, but it's that really extension in the value chain. What that's meant is you go beyond your area of expertise. So again, we heard this morning talking about the importance of a CVC unit investing ahead of the business and recognizing where the strengths of your parent company is, and also as an engineering company, recognizing that they want to do everything themselves. So even if it's a brand new technology, even if it's a brand new thing no one's ever heard of, I'll give this a go and we'll see where we get to, has been kind of the response in the early stages of the automotive industry. So with that and the change we had in leadership, what they wanted was somebody to come in who was an insider. That was really important. I've been with the company for, it'll be 8 years if I make it that far in October. And what they wanted was someone who was used to working across the business. I was a finance professional, so I'd worked in finance my career. And what they wanted was someone to come in and to bring the CVC unit much closer to the strategic direction of where the company was going and to help and assist in that way.
Okay, so there's just a couple of things going on there. So, okay, so how do you and InMotion Ventures respond to all of those shifts and changes? What does that mean then for the role of CVC and the role of InMotion Ventures within the larger JLR galaxy, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, Nicola, you talked this morning about the difference between activity and impact, and I think, that really resonated with me, and actually changed what I was going to say, because I had something else to say, but I'll focus in on the impact piece, because I think it's kind of really important, because the investing thing is kind of relatively straightforward, right? There's books on it, you can learn it, you can do all that kind of stuff. The real impact comes with a CVC unit when you're changing the interaction. You talked about translating between a startup and the parent company. That's where I spend the vast majority of my time, is being that link between the two. And we talk about it being a credible and a safe way for both startups and our parent company to interact with each other. Because there are lots of incidents where it isn't safe and it isn't credible. There's lots of corporations and JLR was one of those, I think, which was very, very guilty of either kind of entrepreneurial tourism, where they would kind of go around and they would look at a few people, conversations would never go anywhere, or they would also be quite exploitative as well of startups and trying to abuse the balance of power. And we heard from the panelists just before talking about the difference in culture and how difficult that is, and that's really where we have focused in on having a foot in both camps, but having a credible foot in both camps. To the point where actually when we look at circularity, which is a big emerging theme for our business, it was our team that led that. So we led the company's strategic thinking around circularity because it was an outside-in view to begin with. That's what the business wanted. But also we were so used to working across the silos, all the business unit silos. And because this isn't going to be something, not only is what we're trying to solve not going to be solved by one VC or one CVC acting alone, it's not also going to be solved by one business unit in our corporate acting alone. So the ability to work across it, I think, is something that we are used to. And I think I've often described our role as being punched in the face from both sides. Yeah. The startup will say, oh, you're being far too corporate. Why is a PO taken more than 3 hours to raise? And you're like, well, I've got to have 9 people to approve it, and they've got to go through all of these kind of processes. And then at the other time, you get beaten up by the corporate for being too entrepreneurial, and what are you doing? And you're bringing risk into the organization and all of those things. So being able to really have a foot in both camps and do it credibly is a balance that, we're still striving for. I don't say, we don't get it right in every instance, but that's the balance that we're trying to achieve, because that's where we believe, again, going back to the impact, I think not only is it about bringing startups into the business in a really credible way, becoming a commercial partner or a supplier or a customer of our parent company, running proof of concepts and pilots to really convince the business that you've got to be looking externally because it's quicker. The automotive industry and many industries are moving much quicker than traditional R&D cycles. We can't do these things ourselves. We can't go and I'm sure we'll hear from a few people this afternoon who might have a different opinion, but we can't just go and sponsor a PhD student who's going to come back in 3 years and tell us that it'll take another 5 years to get somewhere. We've got to be looking in the startup world for these types of activities, but we've got to change the culture in the organization as well. And I think that's something that we believe that third strand of impact, much more difficult to measure, but it's infinitely more powerful, I think, because now we're starting to see people come to us, not when it's too late, not when they found a startup already and they're looking for a cheap way to kind of work within the organization, or they're looking for you to get them out of trouble, because all of a sudden, and again, the guy from eBay was talking about not wanting to be so embedded with a startup, with the parent company, that they're literally will live or die based on the survival of, the relationship with that one company. I think that's where the biggest failing I see, certainly in our company, and what we're definitely trying to shift. Get in there early. Great if you can do it at the strategic kind of formation phase, because that's even better. You can bring in experts that we know, and a lot of you in this room have been very, helpful in terms of your advice that you've given us, and that's helped us kind of move things through. So you're getting there at the right time.
Right.
Because if you don't get that timing right, then it's almost like the gears of a car. If they're misaligned, you just get that horrible crunching noise. And that's what happens.
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like we're talking about, so there's a lot going on. There are multiple different factors that we're now, that you're now having to focus on, right? It's not just about doing the deals, but it sounds like it has completely changed, or I guess maybe expanded the thesis for InMotion Ventures, right? So we're now not just dealing with sort of the normal duality of are we a financial investor, are we a strategic investor, but now, right, almost an academic discussion at this point, and we've now added, I guess, a third leg of the stool, which is impact, and impact now. Is that, you think that's a fair?
Yeah,
that's a fair
completely.
assessment?
I mean, the bit we kind of also need to recognize is, so when I first started in the summer of 22, we're now 3 CEOs down the line and 3 CSOs down the line. So we've had 6 senior management changes in the past almost 4 years. So what that's meant is, A, it's kind of stopped our momentum quite a bit. Now, hopefully not in the external world, because we've tried to keep that very separate. But internally, rather than having an elliptical orbit, which we all like to have, you check in with a parent company, and then you go off, and then maybe you'll come back in a couple of years and say everything's kind of fine. We've been stuck, or certainly I've been stuck in that orbit, kind of going around. And each of the CEOs and the CSOs that we've worked with have had very different flavors of the approach of what they wanted from a CVC. So what we decided on was, right at the beginning, and this was, I think, one of the first slides, I think, and all these in the audience, I think we kind of, one of the first lines we wrote on the very first slide back in the summer of 22 was, why do we invest? Mm-hmm. And that was because what we wanted to do was we invested in startups that were going to accelerate the strategic transformation of the company. That's it. And that hasn't changed. So every time we start on the first, and again, we've done it 6 times now, so we're used to it. That's the first slide that goes up, and that hasn't changed. There's certain nuances in what we've done, and again, everyone's familiar with this. The cycles are longer, venture capital is changing, companies are staying private for longer, which means that we've kind of gone from a kind of, are you strategic to financial to, well, you're and then how do you manage that gap between when that financial return is going to come back and that strategic impact? Because you call it the yin and the yang, right? It's how do you handle this idea that you're looking long term, but in a world where that your predecessor lasted 12 months, I need to show impact right now. So what are you going to show me right now that's going to help me on my roadmap, to kind of going through? And that's one of the reasons why the latest kind of pivot that we've put in is that I'm now responsible for JLR's Open Innovation Program as well. So not only the CVC, but also venture clienting, which again, I think a lot of us in the room have started to move towards. And that's really recognizing the impact that we were having from a venture capital side, and the business kind of going, well, we want a bit more of that. Like, is there stuff that you could help us with now? And the team had done a great job in the parent company to really start cutting their teeth on the activation front. So running the POCs, trying to figure out how it kind of works. How do we, solve the problems, like who's going to pay for it, and how do we measure success, and all of those things. But by bringing the two things together, what we're wrestling with right now, and we haven't got it right by any stretch of the imagination, but we believe that venture capital and venture clienting need to operate in very different circles. So one is InMotion Ventures. We're a wholly owned subsidiary, and we will stay very much in that, where the investment team are contracted to InMotion and are that separate side. But then also we have the parent company employees who are part of the venture clienting team.
Right.
So they're very much, living and breathing. So I spend my time split between the two. I travel, to our parent office, which used to be once a month. It's now twice a week. to really act in that and bring some of that thinking in. But where we see these two things come across, and in the shaded bit of the Venn diagram, is where we really started to see, traction coming, and the impact that we're having for companies that we've invested in ahead of the curve. Once the parent company's caught up and now decided it is a problem that they now recognize they need to fix, well, here's the solution, and we can run a POC, with them. And we found that that's been a way for us to get into a higher quality of deal and of investment than we would have done before.
Sure.
And also what we're seeing is, again, you talked about the changing nature of CVC earlier, and there was a lot of, I think, negativity put towards CVCs who were putting, quite rightly in my opinion, putting in stupid terms into term sheets and side letters and all those kind of things, and you can only work with us, and we need to define your roadmap and all of those things. Actually, it's flipped now. So some of the startups we'll talk to will say, you can only invest in us if you commit to doing a POC within 6 months.
Right.
So now you've got to start up putting something in a side letter to us, and it's been a really refreshing thing. And thankfully we've delivered on that one that we've talked about. But that's where we've seen a real kind of shift, both and how we think that, again, in the context of the parent company that we're working with, and I hope that there are a number of you in the audience who are just shivering with pain, thinking, oh my God, that's like the worst thing I could ever imagine. But maybe take a little snippet, and I've been lucky enough to learn from a lot of people in this room about how they've approached things, and 80% of it would never work in our parent company, and some of it does. And even though we've had such strong leadership changes, that culture of the organization is an incredibly difficult one to shift.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So, well, it sounds like we might have a panel topic for next year. Check in, see how things are going.
If we're still
But,
here, let's touch wood. Right?
And so we've only got a couple minutes left, and I know we've got, you've got a firestorm of things going on here. But let's talk about where do we go from here? So you're gonna run this playbook. Tell me a little bit about your expectations, looking into the crystal ball. Sort of where is InMotion Ventures going now?
I think it's a great question because there's just so many different things.
Yeah.
I think we've got to land what we've started. So this is the third kind of element of our trilogy. Maybe it'll be a 4-part series box set next. But certainly we've got to land the idea that we can run a venture clienting unit and a venture capital unit credibly. I don't see many people doing that right now. Certainly not in the way that we plan to do it, where we have a large element of overlap. That they're very much part of the same team rather than two completely separate kind of entities. So we've definitely got to do that. I think, again, automotive is a very long, sales cycle. We talked, there was a conversation earlier about deep tech and the sales cycles there. We already know 90% of the content that's in the vehicles that will be launching in 2032, 2033.
Right.
So my ambition is, not only are we going to be starting to solve those things that need to be in scale by 2030 because there's a big hole in a car for them to plug into, or a part of the enterprise that we need to kind of support in doing it, but when do we get ahead of that? Because I think that's the real power of a CVC, is genuinely looking at those Horizon 3 type opportunities. But the reality is what's going on in automotive, particularly in Europe, where we're seeing a lot of the new entrants kind of coming in from China, which I know is affecting quite a lot of other companies. But we don't have, outside of Mercedes, maybe BMW, Volkswagen and others, but particularly in the UK, we don't have that massive domestic, automotive manufacturing capacity.
Right.
It's not like the US where, and again, apologies to you, in the sense that, most of the people who drive American cars are in America, right? No one really drives them outside. So you've got a slightly more protection than I think that what we have in Europe. So there's enough for us to be getting on in the next 8 years. So then we'll talk next year if I'm...
Yeah, right.
If I haven't been fired, we'll talk about it.
Very good. Okay. Well, with that, we'll leave the continuation to 2027. And Mike, thank you very much.
Thanks,
really appreciate it.